So this is a tutorial on creating your synthesis paper. This is one of the more difficult papers that students come up against, and the reason for that is because you have found a couple of academic articles and you've read them both and you've annotated them both, and then what you feel like is once you've compared the claims and the arguments in each, what you feel like is that they don't have anything to do with each other. In other words, you feel like you're comparing apples and oranges. And so the question is, how am I supposed to compare these? How am I supposed to bring these into a conversation when they don't seem to have anything to do with each other? And so this is where students get confused because when you're trying to compare the claims straight across, with each other, you can't seem to understand how to do that. And so that is where you have to understand the difference between summarizing a source, in other words, what did the article actually say, and the gist of a source. And that's why the beginning of our textbook talks about summarizing, and then it talks about knowing the gist of the source. So the summary is the actual claims, right? That's where you're able to lay out what exactly did the author say. And it's pretty rare that you're going to find two authors and two sources that say the exact same things, because that is what we call plagiarism, right? Authors aren't going to make the exact same claims and say the exact same words. Um, um, if they did, that would certainly make it easy to summarize them. Or to synthesize them, because then you could very easily say that both authors talked about puppy dogs and both authors talked about how puppy dogs like to wag their tails. But that would be too simple. In other, in order to complete a synthesis, though, you need to understand the gist of the essays that you've read. And that sort of requires that you read between the lines. It sort of requires that you understand the bigger picture of each essay. In other words, what did the author really mean? Not just what did he say, but what did he really mean? What matters to the author? What's important to the author? In other words, what would he or she say if he or she met the author of the other source that you are including in your synthesis? You get to sort of imagine that you are an interviewer, you're a mediator, and you are bringing the author of one article into the room with the author of the other article, and you are sitting them down together, and you are asking them to have a conversation together. What would they say to each other? What points would they agree about? What points would they disagree about? And how do you know? So these last three questions on this slide are the most important questions for you to be able to answer. These are the foundation for the synthesis paper that you will write. And they require you to do a little bit of analysis, right? You're not going to find direct answers to these questions in the articles that you've read. You're going to have to use a little bit of imagination. You're going to have to imagine that you have those authors sitting in a room together, and based on what you've read in the articles, you're going to have to figure out what the answers to these questions would be. What would they agree about? What would they disagree about? And how do you know? And that's information you're going to have to extrapolate from the articles themselves. Okay, now let me show you a sample outline for a synthesis paper. Once you've answered those questions, and again, it takes a little bit of imagination and creativity. It takes you being able to understand the gist of each article, reading between the lines, understanding what's really important, to the authors. Once you've done that, here's an outline for a synthesis paper. You'll begin with an introduction to the topic of your research. Remember that an introductory paragraph should be general. Begin with an introduction to the topic of your research. Identify the purpose of your paper, which is always in a synthesis paper going to be something to the effect of, I am bringing two sources into a conversation with each other. And then end your introductory paragraph with some kind of a thesis statement. And so here's a sample thesis statement. And this is just a sample. But it would be something like, while these two authors, and you'll have introduced your authors in the introduction somewhere, while these two authors agree that vaccinations are necessary and that all children should receive them, they disagree about the ages at which they should be administered. As early as 1 month of age. So that wasn't worded correctly. They disagree that they should be administered as early as 1 month of age, something like that. Okay, so that would be a thesis statement. Then your next paragraph will be a summary of your first source, where you introduce the source, the author, and just the main points. Okay, summarize the main points of that source. The next paragraph will be a summary of your second source. And then the remainder of your paper will be your synthesis. Okay, your thesis statement should have already set up a structure for that synthesis where you've identified the points that you're going to talk about. Now, it's not necessarily going to be 2 points of agreement and 1 point of disagreement. Maybe your synthesis will be all agreement. Maybe you'll have 3 points of agreement. Maybe it will be all disagreement. Maybe you've found two sources that just completely conflict with each other. Those are always kind of fun to write. Maybe it'll be one where there's sort of back and forth, agreement and disagreement and agreement and disagreement. That's completely up to you. In this particular example, I have 2 points of agreement and 1 point of disagreement. So that's how I've set up this structure. So you can see that the first point here was vaccinations are necessary. And so in my first body paragraph, when I get to the synthesis part of the paper, that's the first point I talk about. A paragraph exploring the first point of agreement, that vaccinations are necessary. And I'm going to give examples from both texts. Remember, in the previous slide, I said that you needed to know where they agreed, where they disagreed, and how you know, right? And so in your paper, you need to share how you know. How do you know that author 1 and author 2 would both agree that vaccinations are necessary? Give examples from the texts. Give quotes or paraphrases from each text that demonstrate that both authors would agree that vaccinations are necessary. Then move to your next point. From your thesis, you said that was going to be that they both agree that all children should receive vaccinations. So your next paragraph is going to explore that second point of agreement, that all children should receive vaccinations. Again, how do you know from each text that both authors are going to agree on that point? Share examples, share quotes, share paraphrases. Prove to me that both authors agree on that point as well. And then finally, your third point is that they disagree about the age at which they should be administered, or they disagree that they should be administered at 1 month of age. So there's your final paragraph, a paragraph exploring the point of disagreement, the age at which they should be administered. And again, prove to me that there is that disagreement. So show me that one author might say they should be given at 1 month, and then show me the other author saying no, they shouldn't be given until maybe children are a year old or whatever it is. But show me that conflict between the texts. And then you always want to end your paper with a conclusion. You never leave your paper hanging with a point. You always want to wrap things up. And so end your paper with a concluding paragraph that ties all of this together again, reiterating the topic itself. Vaccines are an important topic, that your sources agree on most points, but there is some issue of disagreement as well. So this would be an outline. Remember that there should always be a summary at the beginning. but that the bulk of the paper should be a synthesis of those sources. Hopefully this helps you understand how a synthesis paper works. Remember that the point is to create a conversation, to facilitate a conversation, but that conversation does require that you read between the lines, that you use some imagination, that you mediate a conversation between authors by understanding the gist of the articles that you're reading. Hopefully this helps and gets you started on your paper.